It's one of the most successful military interventions in modern history. In March of 2022, the government of El Salvador launched a massive gang crackdown. Soldiers were deployed to streets, human rights waived, entire cities put under siege to facilitate house-to-house searches. The results speak for themselves. The year before the war on gangs began, El Salvador's murder rate was on par with that of Guatemala, Brazil, or Haiti. Fast forward 3 years, and recently published data for 2024 shows a nation with homicide levels lower than Canada. Perhaps it's no wonder that Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele is today the most popular leader in all of Latin America. Yet for all of its undoubted success at home, there's something strange about the Salvadoran gang crackdown. No other country has been able to replicate it. And that's not for lack of trying. Nations as varied as Honduras and Ecuador have attempted to follow in Bukele's footsteps with only limited gains in public safety. This even as the Salvadoran government boasts about the model's exportability. And that raises an obvious question. Why? Why do El Salvador's spectacular results seem impossible to replicate? And what does it mean for a region ridden by gang crime if its greatest success was a one-off? Exactly a decade ago, El Salvador was one of the most violent countries on Earth. Plagued by gang crime, its homicide rate stood at a staggering 105.2 per 100,000. Such a figure, to use a technical term, is nuts. To put it in perspective, Haiti is currently facing a wave of violence so vast that the state has basically collapsed. Yet its homicide rate is thought to be 60.2 per 100,000, still an insane figure, but nowhere near that of El Salvador in 2015. Had you suggested back then that within a decade the murder rate of this small Central American nation would be on par with that of Canada, most people would have assumed that you were doing an ironic bit. Yet, that is exactly what has happened. In 2024, El Salvador's homicide rate hit an all-time low of 1.9 per 100,000. That's almost identical to the 1.94 recorded in Canada in 2023, the most recent year that we have data for. It's lower than even the rate in 2 EU countries, Latvia and Lithuania, and it is way lower than the United States, which stood at 5.7 in 2023. Now look, we need to be clear that such comparisons are a little apples to blood-soaked oranges. The Salvadoran government followed different rules for measuring homicides than most nations, meaning things like bodies discovered in mass graves are not counted. As inside crime rights, the government does not follow the Bogota Protocol, the standard for measuring homicides in the region, so its murder rate cannot be directly compared to other countries that do. Still, even if the official 2024 murder rate is an undercount, no one is arguing that the change hasn't been remarkable. The Financial Times reports that December saw this nation of 6.3 million go 24 straight days without a single murder. Considering the crackdown began following a weekend in which gangs killed about 90 people, that is a heck of an achievement. Now, of course, you're already aware of the flip side here. Since March of 2022, roughly 80,000 people have been imprisoned with little in the way of due process. Basic rights have been waived. As a percentage of its population, El Salvador now jails more people than any other nation on Earth. As people from countries that have never experienced a comparable crime wave, we're not going to wade into the debate as to whether the ends justify the means here. That's for the people of El Salvador to decide. What we are going to focus on today are the unusual aspects of the Salvadoran war on gangs, perhaps the most unusual being that it actually worked. For all it seems like something new, the crackdown is basically a revival of Latin America's age-old mano dura policies. While popular, these policies have rarely translated into lasting gains. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador all tried the approach in the 2000s, and all, at best, saw victories that were fleeting. Further north, Mexico's ongoing drug war is simply mano dura by another name, and that has, if anything, made the country far more dangerous and far less stable. As the Journal of Democracy has written, quoting here, decades of mano dura, or iron fist experiments in Latin America suggest that hard-on-crime policies are likely to fail. But these policies didn't just succeed in El Salvador, but did so beyond all expectations, a key to the nation's popularity across Latin America today, or more specifically, the popularity of President Nayib Bukele. As the public face of El Salvador's transformation, Bukele has become widely admired not just in Latin America but across the Western Hemisphere. Just recently, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared, quote, "A country that was once known for violence and for the inability to live openly and freely with one's family and enjoy life has now become one of the most secure in the hemisphere thanks to Bukele's leadership." And Rubio is not alone. Costa Rica's president and security minister have been effusive with their praise for Bukele. The Center for Strategic and International Studies notes that, quote, political parties in Argentina, Ecuador, Honduras, Peru, and Uruguay have explicitly incorporated Bukele's name into their platforms and echoed his tough-on-crime language. Yet for all its evident popularity, there's something else unusual about the Salvadoran crackdown. No other country in the Americas has yet managed to successfully import it. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. Now, to understand the appeal of mano dura in Latin America, you need only to hear one simple statistic. Despite being home to only 8% of the global population, the wider Latin American and Caribbean region sees roughly a third of all of the planet's murders. In raw numbers, that means the region has a murder rate of 20.9 per 100,000 people, compared with a global average of 5.8. While other parts of the world struggle with wars, insurgencies, and terrorism, nowhere suffers under the burden of homicide worse than here. And the major reason? The presence of transnational crime groups, often linked to the drug trade. What El Salvador's crackdown offers, then, is hope that these cartels and armed gangs can be defeated, a perception the Salvadoran government is keen to promote. To quote CSIS again, officials in Bukele's government appear to welcome the idea of exporting the model. So far, the majority of governments trying out the Bukele model are effectively copying from afar rather than flying the Salvadorans in for consultation. Belize, for example, brought in a state of emergency that the local police commissioner, Chester Williams, said was modeled on El Salvador's methods. Chile announced the construction of a Salvadoran-style mega-prison for gang members. Elsewhere, the pressure is more indirect, coming from voters such as Guatemalans who marched in the streets asking Bukele to come and lead their country. But all of this isn't to say there haven't been direct attempts at importing the model. Peru's recent state of emergency and mega-prison plans came after Justice Minister Eduardo Arana visited El Salvador. Argentina has strengthened security ties with San Salvador. Yet whether the Salvadoran approach was simply copied or done with consultation, the results seem to be the same. A mixed bag at best and an active disappointment at worst. Take Belize. Although the country declared a state of emergency in March of 2024 to tackle gang violence, Inside Crime still reports that it ended the year with a 13% increase in murders. Peru, meanwhile, tried to directly import the Bukele model last year, but despite several states of emergency, it ended 2024 with a 35.9% increase in homicides, albeit coming from a low base. And these examples were not just cherry-picked here. While some copycat nations did report increases in public safety, none of them have been remotely comparable to the dramatic change in El Salvador. And that's a mystery that needs to be solved, something we'll try and do by looking at the two main countries to launch a mano dura gang crackdown in the wake of Bukele's success. One which has mixed returns, and one which appeared to fail completely. We're talking, of course, about Honduras and Ecuador. It's often said that Nayib Bukele is Latin America's most popular leader. However, for a few months in the spring of 2024, he lost that crown to another young president overseeing a militarized approach to gang crime. Daniel Noboa became leader of Ecuador at a time when the once peaceful nation was plunging into an abyss. From a nation with a murder rate slightly below that of the United States, Ecuador had become more violent than Haiti. Presidential candidates were being murdered, mutilated bodies hanged from bridges, and prison massacres were routinely killing scores of inmates. Then, in early January last year, Ecuador's gangsters went one step further. In a series of coordinated attacks, they set off car bombs, tried to storm hospitals and universities, and, most memorably, took a TV crew hostage live on air. In response, Noboa declared a state of internal armed conflict, designated the gangs as terrorist organizations, and sent the military in to crush them. While the president claimed that he didn't have much in common with Bukele, it's clear what Plan Phoenix was based on. Soldiers stormed into prisons, curfews were declared, 60,000 suspects were arrested. By the time Noboa's approach was put to a referendum that April, it had the support of huge majorities. So similar to El Salvador in 2022, a trend reflected in Ecuador's falling crime rates. But then something happened. The criminal groups began to fracture and reorganize. The effectiveness of the intervention began to stall. By the end of the year, it was clear there had only been the slightest of improvements in public safety. While homicides were down nearly 13%, rates of kidnapping had soared. As Inside Crime wrote, quoting here, ultimately, the modest drop in homicides masked what was otherwise a year of persistent violence. And that was before the new year got underway. January 2025 was the most violent month in Ecuadorian history. Local outlet El Universo reports that murders were nearly 37% higher than during the previous January, a month so violent that it had led to the declaration of an armed conflict. Now, that's just 1 month, and it's not at all certain that the rest of 2025 will be so bloody. It may be that Ecuador sees another year where homicides remain below their 2023 peak. Still, the fact remains that within a year of launching its own crackdown, El Salvador had seen its murder rate fall from on par with Guatemala to less than that of Uruguay, traditionally considered one of Latin America's safest nations. By any objective measure, mano dura in Ecuador has not lived up to its hopes. A more mixed picture exists in Honduras. There, a state of exception was declared just months after the one in neighboring El Salvador. Initially confined to just 2 cities, it eventually expanded to cover 158 of 298 municipalities. As CSIS writes, President Xiomara Castro has implemented several Bukele-like measures, including the suspension of civil liberties, such as freedom of movement and assembly, and the deployment of 20,000 police and military personnel, end quote. Now, in this instance, the crackdown was done in closer coordination with the Salvadorans. President Bukele even visited the country and received a rock star's welcome. But while the results were better than in Ecuador, they were still somewhat disappointing. First, the good news. Between 2022 and 2024, homicides in the cities of Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula halved. Across Honduras, the homicide rate fell from 35.8 per 100,000 to 25.3. Again, that's a much less impressive fall than in El Salvador, but it equates to hundreds of people being alive who might otherwise have been dead. It also means Honduras has gone from being unusually violent, even by Latin American standards, to being on par with Colombia or Brazil. And now for the less good news. While murders have fallen, other crimes in Honduras remain stubbornly high. Among these, the worst is probably extortion, which the United States Institute of Peace claims is still as bad as it was when President Castro launched her crackdown. And yet, despite now killing fewer people, the nation's gangs still control whole neighborhoods in deprived urban areas. As one interviewee told the nonprofit, quote, "The state of exception has had no major impact in these communities. There's no difference in terms of safety or gang control." For die-hard Bukele fans, the answer as to why both Honduras and Ecuador have struggled might be obvious: the lack of the Salvadoran president himself. But it seems unlikely that one man's charisma alone can be responsible for a crackdown's success. No, what's truly interesting about these 2 examples is how they illustrate the factors that led to El Salvador's victory over its gangs. And they also show why those factors might be so hard to replicate elsewhere. Here's something that might sound obvious, but could be key to understanding why some countries failed where El Salvador succeeded. If you're going to have a tough-on-crime crackdown, you need the police officers and soldiers to enforce it. Remarkably, this wasn't the case in Honduras. When President Castro launched her war on gangs in late 2022, the country had a mere 184 officers per 100,000 people. To put that figure in context, even the safest European countries with negligible murder rates typically have more police officers per capita. Czech Republic has close to 400. Austria has way over 300. Even tiny, crime-free Iceland has more cops per capita than Honduras. Now let's contrast that with El Salvador. As 2023 got underway, Bukele's government had 418 police officers per 100,000 residents. It also had invested heavily in the military, at least by Central American standards. Now, even this might not have been enough had San Salvador been facing sophisticated armed groups, such as in Ecuador, where local gangs have received money and firepower from Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels. But Bukele's government had the added advantage that El Salvador's gangs were relatively weak. CSIS crunched the numbers for the 2 main gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, and both concluded that they were, quote, highly localized and lack significant transnational economic strength. MS-13, for example, was estimated to make just $31 million a year compared to up to $29 billion for a powerful Mexican cartel. The same report estimated that the average MS-13 member probably made as little as $65 a month. On top of that, the economic activities of the 2 gangs mostly focused on shakedowns and extortion, meant they were concentrated in a small number of dense urban areas. As Italy's Istituto Affari Internazionale has written, this is extremely unusual for Latin American crime gangs, which tend to be more spread out. Thanks to this quirk, El Salvador's security forces were able to entirely surround city blocks like Soyapango, block anyone from leaving, and conduct house-to-house searches for gang members. Within larger cities, specific blocks could be given the same treatment. Of course, all of this would have been for nothing had the gangs known in advance what was coming. And it's here that we get to another factor in El Salvador's success, the element of surprise. Now, when the crackdown was launched in spring of 2022, it was not a slow process. Following one extremely murderous weekend, the government declared a state of emergency and went in hard. Outlet Global Americans has written about how gangs were, quote, eminently unprepared to confront the full force of the Salvadoran security apparatus. Now contrast that with what happened in Ecuador. There, the gangs were the ones who struck first, coordinating a series of jailbreaks, massacres, and hostage-takings in a show of strength. While they might not have anticipated quite how hard the state would punch back, there's no doubt that they were ready for a serious fight. As the same outlet writes, quoting here, in Ecuador, gangs were ready and willing to fight in the face of a government offensive. And then there's the issue of prisons. In most of Latin America, from Brazil to Ecuador, gangs and cartels use prisons as bases to recruit new members and direct operations out on the streets. But not in El Salvador. As Italy's IAI writes, Salvadoran prisons have been under extraordinary measures since 2016, long predating the Bukele government. These measures have isolated inmates, reduced chances to talk or make contact, and even kept prisoners from receiving outside visitors. As a result, getting thrown in the penitentiary system in El Salvador already meant being cut off from gang life. And then Bukele came along and built his mega jail, and the rupture became more total still. Today, guards are reported to tear gas entire cells packed with people just to stop a handful of inmates from talking. Now, the Salvadoran government is not alone in thinking that its prisons are a problem. One of the first acts of the Ecuadorian crackdown was to send the military into the penitentiary system to restore order. However, a recent Inside Crime report revealed that gangs seem to have once again taken over key rackets in prisons, such as food distribution. Given the military is still in charge, this points to another major difference between El Salvador on one hand and Honduras and Ecuador on the other, and that's the presence of high-level corruption. It probably won't surprise you to learn that Latin America, pretty corrupt place. With the exceptions of Uruguay and Chile, almost all countries are rated below the global average in Transparency International's annual Corruption Perceptions Index. But there's standard Latin American corruption, and then there's the utter mess drowning Honduras's institutions. There, cartels have infiltrated every level of society, to the extent that former President Juan Orlando Hernandez and his chief of police Juan Carlos Bonilla were both convicted in the US last year for plotting to smuggle cocaine. As CSIS writes, quote, the Honduran government is plagued by corruption within its law enforcement, judiciary, and political institutions. Now, to be clear here, we're not saying that El Salvador is some sort of corruption-free paradise. Transparency International ranks the country as more corrupt than Ecuador and not that far ahead of Honduras. The difference is the extent to which that corruption has led to politicians serving the interests of cartels rather than the public. In Honduras, USIP writes that drug traffickers have, quote, penetrated and corrupted government at the national and local levels. Under President Hernandez, who only stepped down in 2022, that meant turning the country into a safe haven for cartels, even assigning the security services to protect cocaine smugglers who paid the president bribes. A similar story is true in Ecuador. There, gangs funnel money towards politicians and judges willing to take a bribe, and while they kill those that refuse. As The Economist has written, quote, corruption is rife. In 2023, police began investigating several government officials for links with the Albanian mafia. Months later, the main suspect was found dead. In 2022, 25 Air Force officials were punished for sabotaging radar equipment that was monitoring the activity of drug cartels in Ecuadorian airspace. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The ongoing Caso Metastasis investigation has implicated everyone from lead prosecutors to members of the National Assembly. So corrosive has this been to Ecuadorian society that Inside Crime characterized corruption as a national cancer. By contrast, Transparency International links El Salvador's corruption to things like dodgy procurement contracts for public services and a lack of government accountability. A far from ideal situation, but clearly not in the same league as gangs infiltrating the judiciary. Not that there haven't been high-level contacts between the Salvadoran government and the gangs. Shortly after taking office in February 2019, Bukele made a backroom deal with gang leaders to try and keep the violence down. And for a while, it worked. El Salvador's murder rate in 2018 had still been stratospherically high at 51 per 100,000. After 3 years of Bukele, it was down to 17.6. It's an impressive drop. Today, the Salvadoran government likes to pretend that this secret deal never happened. But it's pretty well attested. The United States sanctioned government officials in 2021 for this very reason, and more to the point, it offered concrete benefits. As USIP has noted, quoting here, Salvadoran authorities benefited moreover from their secret negotiations with imprisoned gang leaders. This provided them with valuable intelligence, including a database of gang members and collaborators. By the time the 2022 crackdown came then, the government didn't just know where the gangs were based, but who many of their members were. Combining this with a significant police force and the element of surprise, and it's perhaps no wonder that MS-13 and Barrio 18 were left reeling. Now, these sorts of backroom deals and intelligence gathering, it just wasn't possible in Honduras or Ecuador. In Honduras' case, because the president, until literal months before the crackdown began, had himself overseen cocaine smuggling operations, and in Ecuador's case, because of all the political churn that saw presidents resign early and candidates get assassinated before Noboa came to power. And speaking of political churn, there is one final aspect where Ecuador can't emulate Bukele's model: control of the government. By the time Bukele launched his war on gangs, his party held the entire apparatus of the government in a vice-like grip. To quote the outlet Global Americans, Bukele's party held a supermajority in the legislature. The Supreme Court had been packed with loyalists a year earlier, and Bukele himself was already a wildly popular executive who could also count on the loyalty of the security services. Now compare with Ecuador, where President Noboa has had to contend with both a fractious National Assembly and an extremely short presidential term, a byproduct of the impeachment of the previous office holder. His popularity has also dropped since the halcyon days of early 2024. The first-round presidential election this February saw Noboa get a mere 0.2 of a percentage point more than his left-wing challenger. In short, there were specific advantages that El Salvador enjoyed at the moment the government launched its war on gangs that helped pave the way for its success. Specific advantages that other comparable nations simply do not have. And while this video has focused on the two case studies of Ecuador and Honduras, you could apply the same to almost any nation that's tried to copy the Bukele model. The potent mix of a strong state and powerful security forces, weak and geographically limited gangs, and control over prisons are not found in much of Latin America. And that's before we even get on to the Salvadoran government's handling of the economy. Maintaining a military deployment is expensive, as is building and staffing a mega prison. To do it, the government had to rely on high-interest loans that, as The Economist writes, could have pushed the nation into default. That it remained solvent until an IMF loan was finally agreed to this year was thanks to a potent mixture of skill and just sheer luck. So yeah, if you want to know why the Bukele model hasn't been successfully exported, that about sums it up. For all it may have been tackling the common problem of gang crime, El Salvador was doing so from a unique position, one that gave it the ability to succeed where so many other mano dura attempts have failed. Does this mean that Latin American nations facing horrendous levels of cartel violence should simply give up? Well, no, obviously not. Nor does it mean that the only solution, therefore, is to go in the opposite direction and try and solve entrenched gang crime with hugs and unicorns farting rainbows, which my daughter would love. But it does suggest that there is no easy, one-size-fits-all approach to controlling this surge of transnational drug violence. Rather, each affected nation will likely need to try and find the method best suited to their own advantages, however difficult that might be. Thank you for watching.